Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I have your attention, please? Thank you very much. This is our 9th BIM workshop. 9th today. Next one's our 10th, final in this series. My name is John Daly. I'm a former president of SCSI, and I'm MD in Mulcahy McDonough Partners. And I'm your chairman for this morning, and we're very privileged to have a guest speaker from USA this morning, James Salmon, whom I'll introduce to you in a moment. I have one or two little comments just to make before we do start. Just this journey, this BIM journey, what a wonderful journey it is. And, you know, when we started on this, I certainly knew very little about it. I don't know that much about it yet, but I am learning. And I think it's been most interesting, some of the speakers we've had along the way and the various aspects to BIM that we're all learning about. CITA itself has promoted this with the encouragement and support of Enterprise Ireland. And it's really, really important that that continues. When this series finishes, that we move on to another thing, that Enterprise Ireland continues to support CITA and the work that we're doing. Of course, we also need support from government. This is vital, government being our public sector client organization. Educating our client participating, and understanding why BIM is so important. You all know the format for this morning, and we will have questions for James after he speaks. We'll then deal with the questions for the workshop, again finishing around 10 o'clock, and we hope that you enjoy this morning's workshop. I also would like, of course, to welcome all our people who are tuning in online and participating in this workshop here this morning. A word or two about James. He's president of Collaborative Construction Resources, which is a company that is set up to utilize collaborative agreements, BIM and lean construction methods to deliver construction services more efficiently and productively. Just emphasize that. He's an experienced lawyer, he's a mediator, speaker. One thing I loved to see was he's a strategic change champion. I think we need change champions, don't you? His expertise encompasses integrated project delivery, IPD. He has a lot of experience with public-private partnerships, experience with integrated project insurance, the subject of our last BIM workshop. One that I thought was very interesting is experience dealing with financing and ensuring public-private partnerships. In looking at what we're speaking about this morning, we have a very experienced person to bring us through some of his experiences and who can show us what is ahead. I hand you over now to our guest speaker, James Salmon. Thank you, James.
Come on. I'm not turned on. Can everybody hear me okay? Looks good. Thank you very much, John. And I want to thank CITA and Alan and Ralph Montague. These folks have worked really hard to help me get over here. You can tell they entertained me last night as well. It's been a really, really good several days already in Ireland. I've met with a number of important stakeholders. I've met with engineers, I've met with architects, I've met with the folks at the Office of Public Works, I've met with the Society for Chartered Surveyors. There have been a number of really good meetings that I've already had. What we've done this week is we've tried in these smaller meetings to put a common framework in place, with respect to both BIM and IPD. And today's presentation, I'm going to keep it at those presentations delved into specifics related to what I hoped were relevant topics for those groups. Today we're going to try to keep it at a 30,000 foot level. I'm going to try to focus more on IPD and less on BIM. I'm going to assume that most folks have a good working understanding of BIM. I will use a couple of references to BIM, but typically, normally what I want to do today is focus on IPD. So let's get to it. With this slide, what we do at my company, my typical engagement is a engagement to provide IPD facilitation services. And it's a natural outgrowth of the 20 years of construction litigation that I did, the 20 years of construction project creation, creating legal instruments to help my clients do projects. Now, I went to my law firm about, I guess it's almost 6 or 7 years ago now, and said, guys, we really need to provide a service to our real estate clients, our design clients, our owner clients that is integrated. We need an integrated practice group within the law firm that can deliver these services because they need this from us if we're going to provide them with good, sound legal advice on how to move forward on these major construction projects. And my vision at the time was to have really good lawyers from the real estate department come together with really good lawyers from the transactional and lending side of the office who also worked with litigators who represented constructors and designers and owners in active disputes, and pool our talent as a law firm and deliver better services for those clients. Unfortunately, that was not the vision of the firm and the direction they wanted to go. And so I launched Collaborative Construction, and the idea was to deliver those kinds of services to clients. And so this catchphrase, we deliver built solutions that are smart game changers. At Collaborative Construction, we hope that captures what we do. And we'll get into what all of these terms mean as this progresses. But for now, just think in terms of what it is that you need to put in the formula to get it to equal a built solution. When I say built solution, I mean a facility or a building that's built by BIM builders utilizing IPD and Lean today and tomorrow. There's a lot in there. We'll unpack that as we go through the day. But if you want to get to built solutions, you need smart technologies. You need smart decisions, and you need smart people. So we combine all this, and it allows us to have a really effective system or program. So to put it, sometimes I refer to things in what I call redneck terms. You know, I grew up on a ranch in West Texas, and in growing up, my dad, you know, would convey lessons to us in ways that were very, very effective. And what he said was, you know, son, I'm trying to stop stupid. I don't want you to be stupid. Don't go through life stupid. And unfortunately, a lot of what we do when we deliver under the old set of rules is not very smart. We have a set of legal instruments that aren't very smart. We have a delivery method that's not very smart. And we're delivering services through a series of business models individually that aren't very smart. So again, to put it less delicately, at Collaborative Construction, we often try to stop stupid. We want to realign things. We don't want to have the situation that we see on the screen occur. We want to eliminate those kinds of mistakes. So the classic definition of stupid that we get from Einstein is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Okay? We want to stop that. We want to move forward. So let's talk about the impact of doing things the way you've always done things. And let's start out at a global scale. And over the next few slides, we'll work our way down to the Irish specific numbers. But the lean experts out there that have studied and analyzed the manufacturing process in the US, their studies indicate that there's a waste factor in the construction industry of 30 to 50%. And as I have looked at things around the world, I've become convinced that those numbers reflect a reality in almost all of our economy. Okay, the global economy, which is a $70 trillion economy annually, is filled with waste. And the sources of that waste vary, their inefficiency, their corruption. Sometimes the corruption is so embedded that we just can't do anything about that, but the inefficiency is something that we can absolutely do something about. So if we begin to tackle this problem, we have this globally, we've got 21 to 35 trillion dollars in waste that's in the system. Now, when I meet with especially my general contracting clients, they don't believe these numbers. They say, James, that's not true. We don't waste 30 to 50% of the capital and the effort on a construction project. And it's true that they're not always wasting it in the classic wasted sense, but you've got to remember that with defective or inefficient business processes, you may look like you're being really effective, but you're not delivering value. You're not adding value to the process. And that's a component of waste. So if we move on and start dealing with this, then we have an opportunity to impact these numbers significantly. So if we have something going on that is, taking up a huge percentage of that GDP number because it's being wasteful, we can do something about that, and we have to start at home. So if we turn our attention to the construction industry, it's a $4.6 trillion industry these numbers are from 2006. I know that here in Ireland, your numbers have dropped significantly, something on the order from 40 billion euros down to 7, 8, 9 euros currently. It's been just an absolutely devastating drop for you guys. You were in a bubble, the bubble burst, you've dropped way down. But if we think in terms of how can we eliminate waste and turn that to our advantage and do something with the savings, if we pay attention to the portion of project costs that really drive the capital budgets around the world, I think that focus may be a better place to put our attention than the front end, which is where we tend to be because we're delivering planning, design, and construction services, and we have our blinders on and we're looking at that early phase. But IPD and BIM are designed to empower us as professional service providers and our clients as owners of major facilities and infrastructure to leverage it over time. And when we're able to do that and do that effectively, we're going to impact the cost of operations and maintenance. And these numbers on the screen are taken on a global scale, but you can move the decimal point around depending on your economy, and this all applies everywhere around the globe. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail for just a second. If we're placing something on the order of $5 trillion worth of work globally every year, then over a 20-year period, you're going to place $100 trillion worth of work. So if we look back 25 or 30 or 40 years, whatever the number is, to get $100 trillion worth of work in place, then we know that it has to be operated and maintained. It doesn't just magically take care of itself. Somebody has to operate it, somebody has to maintain it. And we know from looking at the studies that are available from the folks who operate in that maintenance world and the property management world that they typically assign a cost of somewhere between 10% and 30% annually for operations and maintenance costs. Now, they don't break those budgets out very well. They don't give you very good detail, but they routinely allocate something between 10 and 30% of their capital budget every year for operations and maintenance. And so if that's happening on an annual basis, then we're incurring operations and maintenance costs annually on this $100 trillion worth of work that's been put in place of $10 to $30 trillion. Okay? If it's 10% O&M, then you're talking about something like a warehouse or a facility or structure that's not that complex. If they have a 30% budget for 30% of the value of the structure and the infrastructure is operations and maintenance, then it's probably something more complex like a hospital or a casino or something of a higher end and caliber. So the 10 to 30 trillion dollars that's being spent is real money that's being spent in real time every year, okay? If we could just save 10% of that, it's $1 trillion. If we could save 50% of that, of the high end of that number, it would be $15 trillion. And the point of this slide is not to, give you a bunch of really precise data. You could go out and delve into this on a country-by-country basis, an industry basis, any number of things. The point is to remind you that the operations and maintenance costs associated with what we put in place are a huge driver of the budget over the life cycle of that facility. And these are annual numbers, okay? These occur again and again and again and again. So when we have a major consumer of planning, design, and construction services, like here in Ireland, it would be the Office of Public Works, 90 to 95 cents out of every euro in their budget goes to service these costs. It's only 2 or 3 cents out of every euro that's allocated for actual planning, design, and construction services. So a minuscule piece of the budget is dedicated to what we do, our planning, design, and construction services, and putting this infrastructure and facilities in place. But we have a disproportional impact on the life cycle costs of that facility, because if you put a defective facility or defective infrastructure in place, or a facility or infrastructure in place that's not as energy efficient as it could be, or is not an optimally designed facility or piece of infrastructure, and it's going to cost us in operations and maintenance costs, and it's going to cost us every year over and over again for a very long time. So we need to pay very close attention to that, and that's why BIM and IPD are so incredibly important. Because if you use BIM well, if you leverage BIM well in the early phase, in the planning, design, and construction phase, and you're able to hand off a fully integrated BIM model to the owner that is useful and effective, you'll be able to impact that number. So let's talk about something called ROF. What's ROF? ROF is return on failure, okay? This is something we ignore in the industry. Is there some portion of this, we call it savings going forward? Oh, we might be able to save $20 to $300 trillion over the next 20 years. Well, that's interesting. What didn't we waste or lose $20 to $30 trillion doing it the wrong way over the last 30 or 40 years? And if you compound those return on failure numbers like you compound a return on investment calculation, then that $20 to $300 trillion over the last 30 or 40 years becomes an absolutely ginormous number. So what I'm telling you is that there is a return on your failure. When you make mistakes, and they're the mistakes that you can correct and that can be eliminated, it's not just a cost savings going forward. If you don't fix the problem, then you need to be calculating a return on failure alongside your return on investment calculations. Okay? This stuff, we're in a stage where money is king and the bean counters are controlling everything, and they think because they have insisted on a new type of contractor, they're really going to, knuckle down and keep costs low on that 2 to 3 cents out of every dollar, that they're going to solve their problems. But if you reduce the price at which you purchase facilities and infrastructure in that 2 to 3 cents out of every dollar, what are you doing to yourself on the other 90 to 95 cents out of every dollar where the costs are operation and maintenance? It's just a critically important issue, and I know I've spent a little extra time on it here, but it is absolutely one of the most compelling pieces that you can present to the bean counters when they are resisting use of BIM and IPD and these collaborative processes early on. Because the planning, design, and construction phase of a major piece of infrastructure or project is where you have the opportunity to make the most impact. And you're going to be impacting that facility for the entire life of the facility. So typically that's a 50, 60, 80-year window. And it's just critically important. This slide reflects where the World Bank says that the Irish economy is right now. And if we take them at their word and we say, okay, there's a $210, $215 billion GDP in Ireland, does Ireland have 30 to 50% waste embedded in that number? Okay? We talked about it on the global scale. Is there really 65 to 108 billion euros available to be saved? Is there that much inefficiency in the Irish economy? I'm not sure what the exact numbers are, but I would submit to you that there is a tremendous amount of inefficiency in the economy, and tackling those inefficiencies and eliminating those failure mechanisms going forward will serve the country and the economy and everyone in good stead. So we need to pay more attention to all of this. So I already mentioned the fact that you guys have gone through a brutal downturn. But if you think back to 2007 in the boom times, you know, if we had, if you had the opportunity to save some money out of the 40 billion that was invested that year, you know, what was potentially available to be wrung out of the system in waste back then? You know, 12 to 20 billion euros. You know, these are rough numbers, these are rough estimates, but the point is that there's a lot of waste in the system that can be wrung out of the system and eliminated if we start working together in a collaborative and cooperative fashion. So we've talked about all this stuff in some very generic terms, real broad brush strokes. And again, my general contracting clients, some of my folks would come back to me and say, James, you're just full of it. Those numbers aren't accurate. There's not that much waste in the system. So what I've started doing is tracking the cost of RFIs. And this was a pretty difficult bit of data to collect. I've spent probably 5 years at events like this trying to figure out what the cost of an RFI is. Has anyone in the room calculate the cost of RFIs when you're involved in a project? Does anyone track that number? For the record, Your Honor, let the record reveal that not a single hand went up. Everybody's familiar with an RFI, right? I'm not talking about a term that's foreign to you, am I? I mean, these are the bane of our existence as built professionals in the U.S. You know, it's the classic trade contractor walks in and he's looking up at the work and he's supposed to put his scope of work up there and he says, I don't think that's going to fit. I wonder what I'm going to do. So he goes back to the truck and he calls his boss and they have a long conversation, and the upshot of it is an RFI. He writes up a request for information that goes back to the architect. So the architect gets it and looks at it and says, that's not my problem. That's a stupid structural engineer. I'm going to send that on to him. So this RFI begins to wind its way through the system, and they have a cost. They consume staff time. They consume the time of principals. And they consume the time of principals and staff at multiple organizations. Okay, it's not just a single return of an email or a click on it and I read it and I said, oh, that doesn't affect me. Okay, these RFIs have real costs. Now, and remember that an RFI is a very different animal than a change order. Okay? I've got another presentation where the RFI is the little lifeboat hanging on the side, and then you zoom out, and the yacht is named the change order. Okay? Every RFI wants to be a change order someday, you know? Because that's when you're really worth something, is when you become a change order. But RFIs, whether they get approved as change orders or not, add cost to the process, and they're indicative of a failure of communication, aren't they? I mean, they wrote it because they didn't know what to do. They were confused. And so they have a cost. And so let's talk about those costs for a second. These numbers are taken from a private general contractor in the U.S. that wants to remain anonymous because they want to keep their secret sauce back behind their curtain. They don't want anybody to know that they've figured this out and that they're raising their hand in the room like this, or maybe instructing their staff and people that attend events to sit on their hands and not reveal these numbers. But in vertical work, that is, you know, commercial towers, an RFI costs this organization approximately $3,500 on average. In road work, where they're building roads, it's $5,500, and when they're building water treatment plants, it costs them $10,000. And I asked them, I said, did you calculate the cost to the other team members? No. Did you calculate the cost to the owner? No. These are our internal costs associated with dealing with RFIs. So, you know, the general contractor gets RFIs from all the trade contractors, and they are a central point for these. So, private designers in the U.S. also have begun to track the cost of RFIs to their firms, and there's a nice size regional design firm that has spent time and effort figuring this number out, and they say it's $2,500 for an RFI. And again, they're calculating that number in the silo. They're not looking outside towards anybody else. They're calculating the cost to their business. The most authoritative source that I have, and I can share the identity of the source, is a person from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And this is at one of these events where I said, does anybody calculate RFI costs? His hand went up, and I said, okay, can you tell us what they are? And he gave us the number, and I said, oh my goodness, how do you know that? And he said, because that's my job. He said, my job is to track the cost of RFIs on U.S. Army Corps of Engineer projects worth more than $50 million. And he said, you know, I have run the red tape to ground and identified the cost all the way through. And on $50 million plus projects for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the cost of an RFI is $7,500 to $10,000. Okay? Now, what I've discovered, when I litigate cases, I find entire conference rooms filled with books, binders, full of RFIs. Okay, there may be 5,000 or 6,000 RFIs on a major failed project. Now, I know that on a typical project, we are not going to see anywhere near that many RFIs, because RFIs are an indicator of failure and failure to communicate. And on a failed project where everybody sued each other and it's gone to hell in a handbasket, there are more RFIs. But that doesn't mean they're any cheaper on the projects that are going well. The cost of the RFI is still there. So some of the folks that I've worked with say that RFIs represent between 8 and 12% of the cost, the total cost of any given project. So what is our return on failure on that? If we take these numbers, if we cut them in half even, and say, okay, there's a cost associated with RFIs that I deal with. Everybody in this room can go back to your office and look at your last 2 or 3 projects and identify how many RFIs you had, okay? And you can make a calculation based on these numbers as to what the return on failure associated with those is. And you can calculate what your cost of savings will be going forward. So people say, well, how do we get rid of RFIs? Well, remember, RFIs are an indication of a failure to communicate effectively. And that's where BIM and IPD come into play. There are plenty of RFIs in a good, high-quality IPD and BIM-driven project. It's just that they're all virtual RFIs, and they almost always get resolved by the trade contractor who's in the room with the specialty designer, who's in the room with the architect, who's in the room with the superintendent, and they're all looking at it on the big screen, and they're doing clash detection. And the trade contractor is saying during that meeting what his staff guy will say, 18 months later. That don't fit. I can't do that. You have drawn something that won't work. And you resolve it there. You resolve it then. Now that takes a bit of staff time. I'm not going to stand up here and say that RFIs in the virtual world are no cost. There is some cost there still. But it is exponentially cheaper to solve it on the computer screen than it is to wait and let somebody circulate a real live RFI later, which is just quivering in anticipation of becoming a change order. So don't do it. Eliminate them, and the way you eliminate them is with IPD and BIM. These tools are the tools that are going to allow you to do this and do this more effectively. So I'm going to move this along pretty quickly now that we've gotten through that talk about RFIs, and that's the tail end of my long speech about waste. Okay, we started out at the $70 trillion global level, abstract numbers that it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. We brought it down to the Irish economy, and then we brought it down specifically to RFIs. Okay, there are probably dozens of other good waste cost metrics that we could lay our hands on and begin to calculate and track better than we do now. But I focus on RFIs because I've got this data, and they are ubiquitous throughout every project, and they're an easy thing for everybody to turn to and look at. It's an easy thing for you to show your clients where there's a piece of waste that can be addressed. For those of you that have attended other events where I've spoken, you know that I'm totally enamored with my arch and the arch structure. I think it just captures the concept of IPD very, very well. It also captures the concept of several other programs that collaborative construction offers, and one of those is the Built Solutions program. You remember Built is built by BIM builders utilizing IPD and Lean today and tomorrow. So to the X power, you can change those things and make those things mean a lot of different things inside the parentheses with the algebraic equation approach to that. So Built Solutions, they're a smart game changer, okay? And if we look at this arch structure and we want it to support Built Solutions, the one side of this is going to be BIM to the X. Now, there's plain old vanilla BIM, which y'all are all very familiar with, but I use the term BIM to the X because BIM does not just mean building information modeling. BIM also means business information modeling, okay? It also means business innovation modeling. It is not just modeling, it's management. So it's building information management. It's business information management. It's business innovation management. There are fundamental differences between modeling and management. Modeling is a graphic representation. It allows you to get a visual. Management implies that I've tracked metrics before and I have data that I am looking at over time, and I'm now managing something associated with that prior data. If you're not measuring it, how could you possibly be managing it? That just blows my mind. I see these people parachuted into places and they're the new manager. You don't know anything. You can't manage anything if you don't know the history, if you don't know the data, if you don't know what it is you're managing. Managing without knowing the data is not really effective. So, BIM to the X. Imagine if you use your BIM to the X tools to carve the blocks on the left-hand side of this arch. You have a nice arch structure that's building up on the left-hand side and it's leaning over. On the right-hand side of the chart, we're going to move away from the technical, software-driven virtual design and construction piece of the puzzle and look at the hands-on management side, the placing the work in the scope, and the team chemistry issues. So CM to the X power refers to classic construction management. It also refers to change management. because one of the most important things that happens in IPD and BIM implementation and adoption is that we need to have a change in our mindset in order to move forward. So CM to the X also includes the concept of change management. And finally, in my shorthand term CM to the X, I'm including cultural management, because the culture within which this work takes place needs to be managed and addressed. One of the most fundamental and important things about an integrated agreement is that it arises out of pre-existing trust-based business relationships, okay? And when you have a culture, an adversarial culture, which pits parties one against another, and which involves parties typically suing one another, you create a culture of mistrust or distrust. And that is the culture that is the construction industry. It is the case in the US. I understand it to be the case here. It's the case around the world. The construction industry is not a trusting industry. So it's a very difficult thing to bring integrated project delivery, really creative and good legal instruments that are collaborative in their nature to bear on an industry like that that suffers from a huge amount of distrust. But that is why the cultural management piece is so important, and we've got to start dealing with it. So you build up that half of the arch, and now you've got the arch structure leaning in on itself. You've got to put your keystone in place. And the keystone are the smart legal agreements, the integrated agreements, the collaborative agreements, the things, the legal tools that work. So let's talk about this concept of a smart game changer. What is a smart game changer? Something can be defined as a smart game changer if it's simple, scalable, meaningful, actionable, relational, and transformational. I know that's a mouthful, but all of those words are really powerful conveyors of information about this concept. Simple, okay? Back to my West Texas roots, we always said, keep it simple, stupid. You know, you want things to be easy. So if something is going to be a smart game changer, it has to be simple. And BIM and IPD are simple. They appear to be a lot more complex than they are, and there are a lot of people who make them more complex than they are, but they are simple tools. We could form an integrated team this afternoon to build a new shed for somebody. We could design it in BIM. Somebody could sign up for a free Google SketchUp account, and we could design it in Google SketchUp. We could put somebody in charge of going and getting the materials. We could put somebody in charge of construction. We could assign tasks, and within a couple of days at the most, we could have a new work shed built for somebody. And we could do it using IPD and BIM. It'd be very simple. But BIM is also an IPD. They're all scalable, okay? So if you've got Google SketchUp on one end, then you've got Dassault Systems' CATIA program on the other end. If you need to be more precise, if you need to design a nuclear power plant and you need to be able to run failure analysis in a nuclear power plant, then maybe that $1.5 million CATIA license is for you. That CATIA program from Dassault Systems will allow you to virtually unscrew the bolts and test things in ways that will blow your mind. Now, we don't need that level of sophistication in most of what we do in the construction industry. But the point is that there is a range of tools that are scalable that are available. And IPD is the same way. It's very scalable. It can work on the smallest project. It can work on the biggest project. Next is meaningful. If something is a smart game changer, it purposefully adds value to the process, or it purposefully solves a problem. And BIM solves all kinds of problems. It solves problems with quantity takeoffs. It solves problems with constructability. It solves problems with clash detection. It solves problems with energy analysis. It's an incredibly powerful problem-solving tool. And IPD solves one of our most fundamental problems as well. It solves the problem with mistrust and distrust. It solves the problem with siloed delivery. IPD solves several really important problems for the industry as well. So it is very meaningful as well. Actionable. Smart game changers are actionable. You can act on them now. We can deploy them in the real world now. The shed example ties back to this. They're relational, okay? You wind up getting cross-pollination of ideas on a cross-disciplinary basis when you have smart game changers taking effect, okay? You see various disparate groups that maybe didn't think they were connected, realizing they are connected and that there's an important piece of information that we need to exchange. And so these smart game changers are relational in the sense that they cause these connections to be recognized. And we need a whole lot more of that in the built industry. We need to be getting up out of our silos and communicating on a cross-disciplinary basis and sharing ideas and cross-pollinating ideas on a multidisciplinary basis. Finally, a smart game changer is transformational. It disrupts existing business processes. And I think you're all very keenly aware that BIM is that kind of disruptive force. It's driving things in ways that we had not anticipated before. So we've already talked about built solutions. We've already defined BIM. We've already talked about CM to the X power. Let me talk briefly about integrated project delivery. Integrated project delivery can be characterized as follows: early engagement, pain share, gain share in compensation and risk, collaborative control, ADR processes, and collaborative development and validation of targets and goals. Now, I could bore you with the exact excerpts from and blown up underlined versions of specific contract language, but I'll just tell you that there are multiple versions of integrated agreements that are available in the marketplace. Collaborative construction has a set of integrated agreements that we use. Our integrated agreements have taken what I perceive to be the best qualities out of the AIA instruments, the American Institute of Architects in the US, and what's called consensus docs, which is a different set of legal agreements that are offered in the US. They have an instrument called the Consensus Docs 301 series. The Consensus Docs 301 series is a fully integrated agreement that contemplates being signed by an owner, a contractor, and a designer, and then further contemplates having additional trade contractors and specialty designers sign on to the agreement through a series of joining agreements. So there are existing template documents out there in the commercial world. They're easily accessible, they're easily purchased over the web, and they're a great starting point. But I caution everyone not to begin with that printing out the document and circulating it. That's the worst way to negotiate an agreement. And I'm going to let y'all experience an exercise later. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of extra time for you to do this. Go through identifying deal points for specific things. These other elements that are on the board here, these are all addressed in some very specific instruments associated with these integrated legal agreements. The early engagement part is driven by RFPs and RFQs that owners that want to procure bids from integrated teams utilize. So if you're a public owner and you want to procure planning, design, and construction services from integrated teams, but you're bound by a bid requirement in the state laws and regulations, all you have to do is put out an RFP that calls for bids from integrated teams. Force the construction and design community to team up and form those teams in advance and submit you bids as a team on the work as a whole. Okay? It's a pretty simple way of dealing with the problem. Everybody's very afraid of the mandatory laws and rules and regulations. In the U.S., we deal with this all the time. We've got the federal procurement laws and regulations in the United States. The absolute worst set of procurement laws and regulations on the planet. They're horrible. They were produced in the 1950s, and they've become a Frankenstein since then, had parts and pieces clamped on, and they're just awful. But we have agencies in the United States at the federal level that are demanding BIM, requiring BIM, and procuring planning, design, and construction services under IPD light type arrangements because they've worked at crafting a set of RFPs and RFQs that work under that constrained framework. So it's doable. Pain share, gain share agreements. We always draft a good pain share, gain share agreement that addresses how we're going to share compensation, how we're going to share risk on a major integrated project delivery agreement. We always address collaborative control in the agreement. We make sure that everyone feels like they are a stakeholder and they have something to say, because they do. And there's important times. On an IPD project, you don't always have the same leadership. You don't have a leader that is a single person. There's a leadership baton. And that leadership baton gets passed from one entity to another depending on the phase of the project. Because at some points in time, the structural engineer needs to be the lead person explaining to everybody what's going on and why this is important today. At other points in time, it needs to be the project manager who has boots on the ground and knows what's going on and needs something else. At other points in time, it may actually be a trade contractor who has holding the leadership baton because their scope of work is time and path critical and needs to get done now. So in a collaborative or integrated agreement, we recognize that there's a core management team, but we also recognize that that leadership baton gets passed around. Okay, so we have collaborative control of the process. The ADR process, ADR stands for Alternative Dispute Resolution. And in a really good, high quality, integrated agreement, you are always going to have an effective dispute resolution mechanism. And this is something you have to insist on this. You have to tell your lawyers to back off and keep their nose out of it, and you have to insist that you don't want to go to court, okay? This gets back to our trust element, okay? It gets back to how we build trust among our integrated team members, okay? If we are going to have a trust-based relationship, and we're going to be able to engage in this, leadership baton transfer and collaborative control and all of those things, we've got to have a legal agreement that is strong enough to impose these new ideas on people who might not be as receptive to them, and make sure that it all works. Any good legal instrument has to have teeth. It has to work. But the teeth don't have to come from the court, okay? You have a right, you're individuals, you have your individual liberty, you have liberty to contract as you see fit as a business. And you can make a contract. You can make an agreement. And what I tell my clients is, look, guys, you can adjust your legal relationship in whatever manner and under whatever set of procedures or mechanisms you choose. You do not have to concede that if something goes wrong, you're all going to sue each other and have a race to the courthouse steps. You can put a different set of dispute resolution mechanisms in place in your instrument. And that's what we always do. We include a very substantive dispute resolution mechanism in the agreement, and we use it. And one of the most important things that we do is we reach out early on and we identify the mediator, and we hire that person in advance, and the team agrees. So if we're building a hospital, then let's go find somebody who's built a hospital. You know, let's find somebody who's designed a hospital. If we're building a server farm or a bridge, find somebody that's built a server farm or a bridge. You're all going to know somebody in the industry that you respect. And that's the most important thing in a mediator. They don't have to necessarily even be a trained mediator. I've used very good industry professionals who got the job done, who were not necessarily trained as classic mediators. And you absolutely don't necessarily need a lawyer. Now, sometimes that turns out to be the best choice, but typically what I've found is that we want somebody who understands what we're doing. I want a mediator who's going to be able to tell the parties how the cow's going to eat the cabbage. All right? When the dispute arises, I want them to be able to say, look, I think this is how this deal's going to shake out. Experience-wise, I've been there, done that. You know, been there, got the t-shirt, and I'm back. So let's not do this again. And that kind of mediator who has that kind of perspective can really help you solve things and keep things moving forward. But the most important thing about having the mediation mechanism in your agreement and having it be mandatory that you bring problems to the fore is that we eliminate this process of, writing up potential issues and putting them in our hip pocket and waiting. We force these issues to the surface and we deal with them. I say you got to lance the boil and cauterize the wound and move on. There is not a problem on any construction job I've ever encountered as a litigator in 20 years that ever got better by sweeping it under the rug. They all got worse every single time. So, collaborative development of validation and goals. Again, this is back to the early part, once the RFP is made and the owner brings that group in, then they begin this collaborative development of validation, targets, and goals. The most important one being your target cost estimate, and we may talk about that in a little bit. Can someone tell me where we are time-wise? 10 past 9. So 9:30 should be when I wrap up? Okay. So you've already seen a version of the arch structure, okay? That arch structure in the first slide we looked at was supporting the built solutions, okay? Here it's supporting IPP, IPD, IOM in 3D, okay? IPP is integrated procurement programs, IPD is integrated project delivery, and IOM is integrated operations and maintenance, okay? Collaborative construction has an IPD in 3D program that we use to help owners that are major consumers of planning, design, and construction services put a procurement program together that's integrated and that's going to be complementary of the next phase, which is integrated project delivery. So we do the facilitation of an IPD contract on a specific project, but in the IPP world, we're talking about putting together a set of integrated procurement procedures and processes that will enable that owner to procure more than one project in an IPD environment, okay? IOM, Integrated Operations and Maintenance, this program helps the owner achieve BIM to FM, okay? We want the owner to be able to take the data that arises in the IPP process and in the IPD process and use it in integrated operations and maintenance. So BIM to FM. And I've written a series of articles on this in Augie World magazine. It's called the Built BIM to FM series. And you know, there's probably 7 or 8, maybe 9 articles in that series that deal with built BIM to FM issues. So this art structure gets built exactly the same way we talked about the earlier one. Lean construction. I don't know how familiar you are with the lean processes. Lean construction contemplates a scenario in which you go through this cycle continuously. You innovate, you educate, you motivate, you negotiate, and you perpetuate. So you innovate, you come up with a good idea, you educate other people about it, you motivate them to get it going. You negotiate, because what happens is somebody's ox is getting gored somewhere. When you come up with an innovative change, you've got to negotiate how it gets applied. And then you perpetuate. You capture the knowledge that you've acquired and you're prepared to use it again and again. We don't do a very good job of perpetuating in the construction industry. And the concept is to optimize the whole. We want the entire process to be more efficient. And so we're willing to make some sacrifices in certain areas in order to have it be better somewhere else. And for the construction industry, and especially the government owners, this optimizing the whole concept, I think, is critically important. Okay, they need to pay attention to the fact, as we spent some time dealing with early on, it may be the case, I don't know that this is the case, but it may be the case we need to be spending 4 to 5 cents out of every dollar on planning, design, and construction services. Rather than, you know, ratcheting that budget down, maybe it needs to be going the other direction, because the return on investment in O&M cost savings may be so significant. So being, you know, penny wise and pound foolish with respect to that 2 to 3 cents, it may not be optimizing the whole, because the whole is the life cycle of the entire facility over time. So let's talk for just a minute about how all this comes together and what we see when we put it all in one place. I use this aqueduct slide to convey the idea that we are transferring information and knowledge, okay? The aqueduct carries water. In our metaphor, it's carrying information and knowledge. We are entering an information and knowledge economy, okay? We're through the information age. It's done. Ask your kids, okay? They know that. We are entering a knowledge-based economy, and we've got to be prepared to compete. So we need our information and knowledge to flow, all right? Right now we have a series of silos that we leave all of our knowledge in the construction industry. Even the best BIM models right now are left at the bottom of the silo in which they were built. Nobody brings them to the surface, nobody shares them, and they never get handed off to the owner. So we want to be able to carry all that information and knowledge forward over time vis-a-vis our facilities and infrastructure. And so we need to have this arch structure built up. And all the other 2 slides that we've looked at that dealt with arches, All those get recreated here, as well as several dozen others. If y'all can imagine, I've got lots of presentations with arches. The fun on the far left would be IPP, so there's your integrated procurement program. The one in the next one to the right would be IPD, then to the right of that would be IOM. And then on top of that, you've got lean logistics, you've got lean supply chain management, you've got last planner system. It all builds up. The little arches at the top are all the trade contractors and the specialty designers. Everybody has a piece to play, okay? So each of those arches has a keystone and needs to be supported. And you can see here that the keystones jump in. All the different things that are going on in that arch structure are all addressed in this slide. I could probably spend a lot more time on that slide. But this concept of arches, I like the arches. I think that they convey, a good metaphor. They're a good metaphor for conveying this information and helping us figure out where we're going. Here we've got two very interesting arches that were the result of major infrastructure projects in the U.S. We've got the Hoover Dam and then a major bridge in front of the Hoover Dam. So these concepts, the concepts of the arches and the support structure for the things that you do, are what I want you to take away from this. I want you to be thinking in terms of how is the information and knowledge economy that we know we have to compete in going to impact us? What are we going to do to be able to compete in that world? And you have to have these solid foundations in place to do that. So what we do right now is we deliver this set of federated BIM blocks to owners. And those BIM blocks, if you'll imagine all those different colors being the different softwares. So Bentley is represented, Autodesk, everybody's represented on the left-hand side in the block structure. And so what we do now is we deliver this to an owner, and the owner gets this set of blocks, and they don't know what to do with it. What we want to get to is we want IPD and BIM to the X to be the smart game changers that they are and get us to an integrated BIM, which is the image on the right. What happens right now is we negotiate our contracts out of these bunkers. So everybody retreats to a bunker, and this is how we do design, bid, build. So our designers retreat to their bunker, our owner retreats to theirs, and contractors to theirs. And it's not an effective way to either negotiate the contract or to implement the contract. So our traditional project delivery is chaotic and adversarial, and we do not want silos. We want to eliminate these silos and get out of the silos and collaborate and communicate on a cross-disciplinary basis. So if we're going to deliver this integrated BIM to the X and not the federated BIM to the X, we're going to have to start delivering to owners a much more effective BIM model, and we're going to have to work very hard together to figure that out. What owners are getting right now is a jumbled set of blocks. You might say it's a Rubik's Cube in Braille when you hand it off to the owner, and the owner doesn't know how to figure out what's in the BIM model. I call it Humpty Dumpty BIM. We're delivering this pile of blocks over the wall. Humpty Dumpty is breaking, and the owner has no idea how to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Okay? We need to get away from this federated BIM model and move on to the integrated BIM to the X model. So we've already covered in the slide earlier most of the information about the differences between traditional and collaborative agreements. What I will remind you of is the number one issue, which is that integrated and collaborative agreements arise out of pre-existing trust-based business relationships, and that's very different from the traditional contract that just creates a relationship out of whole cloth. So we need these trust-based environments. It's where we build these good relationships. You need moral trust, trust in competency, and trust in follow-through. Those are the three key elements to trust. And the way you build that kind of trust, the most effective mechanism is open and honest communication. And frankly, that's what happens when you come together to negotiate an integrated agreement in that workshop setting. That's where a lot of this good trust building has an opportunity to take hold. So I already mentioned moral trust, trust in competence, and trust in follow-through. We already talked about pain share, gain share agreements. Those pain share, gain share agreements are usually negotiated as a protocol that's attached to an integrated agreement. They are very effective mechanisms for helping parties share both the risk and the compensation. We already talked about laddered alternative dispute resolution and selecting your mediator in advance. So, collaborative deal making, this is the idea that we don't start with the instrument. We start by trying to find out what our common interests are and where those interests overlap, and that's where the deal gets made. That's where your best contracts are written. So we've already talked about IPD and the art structure, and I think that's the end. I had to speed it up at the end to stay on time, but I think I did.